Okay, so I was kind of sort of tagged or suggested by Why Not Art to do like the 50 comics, do the 50 comics thing. And the first version of this I did was like way too long. It actually went to almost like 2 hours. So I'm going to try to not go on for 2 hours. I just have a real bad tendency of like starting to talk about stuff and ramble and ramble and ramble. But like I said, I'll try to make a more compressed version. So some of the, or I should just say, some of the comics I have, I don't have like tons and tons of really great key issues, and a lot of sentimental comics that I used to have, I just don't have anymore. So some of the comics I have will be kind of key issues. Some will be more sentimental. A lot more will just be random comics that I just think are like interesting for one reason or another. So let's start with here. This is Love and Rockets Book One. This is the version that this is the original printing that I've had forever from since it first came out. And I think I just read this comic book at the right point in my life. I was ready to kind of move beyond just the typical Marvel DC type of thing. It appealed to me. The whole punk rock thing appealed to me. The whole thing that you have, even though a big thing isn't made out of it, the fact that you have minority characters in there, the idea that you have alternative ideas of like I guess sexuality and things like that. So, and plus there is still enough of that kind of genre hook and old school comics influence where you can see the Steve Ditko, the Wally West, the Charles Schultz, the Dan DeCarlo, all that stuff is just very obvious in it, and they just made a real unique blend and put their own spin on it. And yeah, I just yeah, it was just a really this comic really meant a lot to me. So there's a more recent comic book. This is Last of the Innocent. This is from Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips' Criminal series. It's going to sound like weird because on one hand, I'm not so sure it's the best of the series, but it is probably my favorite. And it has a lot to do with the fact that they really play with the idea of not just the thriller ideas and tropes, but the whole sort of playing with the medium of comics as well. Um, well, I don't want to give too much away, but this is a story that you could do in live action, but the way it works on the page works better as a comic. So uh, here's Severus Biweekly #1, which has a reprint of the very first issue of Severus, where it was basically the idea of doing a parody of Barry Windsor Smith's version of Conan, and instead of having a dude in there, you've got this aardvark character in there, and that was kind of the whole joke. This is kind of interesting because they reprinted the whole thing, including ads and back covers and stuff. And here's an interesting thing here, where there was an ad for Gene Day, artist Gene Day, who passed away, um, doing a portfolio of Star Wars inspired art, and Lucasfilms came at them and made Gene Day discontinue selling it or whatever. So all right, and this is Freak Brothers #4. At one point, I actually had reprints. I had a couple of the original issues, but most of them I had reprints of 1 through 10, all the way up through Idiots Abroad. And don't have them anymore, but I kind of need to get them again. I keep seeing them pop up online and stuff like that, but it's always more money than I really want to spend on it. Okay, so here are reprints of the Spectre series from the '70s by Jim, by Michael Fleischer and Jim Apparel, that originally ran in Adventures Comics. Just really kind of not quite gruesome, but kind of hard-hitting pseudo horror type stories. Uh, I'm gonna mispronounce his name. This is Ranks of the Black Order. This is a graphic novel that's kind of out of print. That came out from Catlin Communications by Belay and Christian. And I actually remember when these guys used to get a lot of art published in or I should say where I got exposed to it was from Heavy Metal magazine. Just as really just a pretty much a straightforward kind of political drama thriller type story. Uh, Howard the Duck #5. This is the magazine version. The stories were written by Bill Matlow, and the art is by Michael Golden, and the backup story is by the artist by Gene Colan. Not quite as insightful or as biting as Steve Gerber, but pretty good. There are other issues of this run that aren't that great, but uh, this I got a hold of. I can't remember exactly how I came across this comic book, but this is a comic called Date with Debbie that was published by DC Comics back in the 70s. Kind of a Betty and Veronica, you know, girl next door, wacky hijinks kind of comic. Obviously, they were going for that kind of teen comedy, Archie type style thing. Uh, Savage Tales #1. This is from the mid '80s. This has, well, the editor was Larry Hama, and this has Fifth to the First, which was this pretty much realistic war stories set in Vietnam. And this series, the artist by Michael Golden, and was written by Doug Morey. Yeah, Doug Morey. And it pretty much evolved into a series that Marvel did back in the late 80s, early 90s called The Nam, which was just a straightforward, realistic depiction of soldiers in Vietnam. Dirty Pair #2. This is the second of a miniseries called Plague of Angels, art by Adam Warren, or art and story by Adam Warren. This is pretty funny. There's a scene in here where the two lead characters sing karaoke, and they sing a Faith No More song. Whoops. And they sing a Faith No More song. I know the anime was kind of, I guess, semi-popular, but I've never seen any of the anime. Shorts by Milo Manera. Adults only, and it's pretty much what you think it is. Well, actually, you know what? It might not be what you think it is. It's a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek short stories that are all kind of semi-softcore. Believe it or not, though, as much as it's pretty much going for this sort of erotic type thing, it's actually not that explicit. There isn't a whole lot of actual nudity. Anyway, yeah. Even though it's Mago Monero kind of doing kind of sexy, saucy stories, there really isn't a whole lot of nudity. There's like almost no nudity in it, so I think that's very interesting. Nothing else. More Inky Balay. I'm saying his name wrong. Outer States. Lots of short stories that have appeared previously and stuff like Heavy Metal and whatnot. This is one of my favorite Wonder Woman stories. This is Wonder Woman Truth by Paul Dini and Alex Ross. Just a really great story that kind of looks at the whole sort of ideal of Wonder Woman, more or less. And another oversized comic that came out from the same time period, JLA Heaven's Ladder by Mark Waid and Brian Hitch and Paul Neary. Just some awesome art, big crazy science fiction-y story, and it was just really well done. I actually think I did do a video regarding this comic book. And what else? I wanted to do one about Angel and the Ape. but I need to get some more of the um, early '70s version, the original run. I do have the miniseries from the late '80s, early '70s, or late '80s, early '90s, where they actually tie the characters into the greater DC, universe, post Crisis. And then I have the vertical version from like early 2000s that was written by Howard Chaykin, where they go back to the original concept, but they do a little bit more edgier adult version of it. These are like some really great covers by Art Adams. Look at that. I just thought these covers are just really awesome. At least 3 out of 4 of them, anyway. Okay, and Kill Your Boyfriend by Grant Morrison and Philip Bond. This is a DC vertical one shot. No fantasy elements or anything like that. Just a straight up story about teen rebellion. Fantastic Four 247. This is the issue where the Fantastic Four actually helped Doctor Doom. They actually helped reinstate him as the ruler of Latveria, because the guy that took over after Doctor Doom was gone was actually worse. Jungle Action number 20 by Don McGregor and what the hell, Billy Graham, the artist by. This is basically in the middle of a long ongoing story where the Black Panther actually goes to the American South because he's helping his girlfriend investigate the murder of her sister, and he ends up taking on the Ku Klux Klan. And this particular issue has a kind of a moving monologue by a reporter who's involved, talking about how and why he actually wants to help and be involved. Black Hawk. This is a prestige miniseries by Howard Chaykin from the mid 80s. I was going to do a video about this, but I have to reread it first. It's been a while since I read it. Automatic Kafka number 4 from Wildstorm / DC. This was a series by Joe Casey that came out in the late 90s, early 2000s. It really flew under the radar. Basically, it is the reworking of a pitch that he sent to DC that was going to rework the Doom Patrols, that was going to revamp the Doom Patrol. DC didn't take his pitch, so he reworked the concept as this kind of weird, strange, avant-garde comic. I think it was kind of hurt by a lot of the art. It's actually really weird and sketchy, and it's hard to tell what's going on sometimes. This is a pretty funny issue because in this particular issue, you have characters who show up and it's not obvious, but they're basically parodies of the Peanuts characters. There's this schlubby guy here. Here's a redhead girl there. There's a dark-haired psychiatrist. She's obviously got the hots for this piano player dude, so it's kind of an interesting story. Planetary number 21. This is probably my favorite issue of Planetary. Basically, Elijah Snow goes to see a woman for advice, and more or less she takes him on a psychedelic trip when he figures out how it is he has to defeat his enemies, the Four, who are basically, if you read between the lines, an evil version of the Fantastic Four. Speaking of weird psychedelic trips, Giant-Sized Man-Thing number 4. This basically has the return of Howard the Duck by Steve Gerber and Frank Brunner. and I have no idea what this means. I have no idea that anybody knows anything about anything. I don't know what psychedelia is. I don't know who Timothy Leary is. I certainly don't suspect that these baby boomer guys would be hip to any of that sort of thing and do anything like that at all, especially considering how crazy and psychedelic this art is. Okay, anyway. Ah, let's see here. Wonder Woman 202, written by Greg Rucka. This is actually a comic book I like a lot. I just like the story. It's basically the backstory of Veronica Cale, who at the time was more or less going to be Wonder Woman's Lex Luthor type figure. And I just think it's a solid story. And I have E-Man #1 by First Comics. Basically, I guess Joe Staton somehow bought the rights back from probably Charleston. Well, he would have had to have gotten it from Charleston. This is the early 80s, and this is probably right before DC bought the other characters, Captain Atom and Blue Beetle and all those type of people. So basically, I think he bought the rights back, split the rights with the original artist from the original writer, and then took it to First Comics. And also here I have this. This is Modern Comics, which I guess was a reprint label of those Charleston comics. I know they did this. I know they did a couple of issues of Blue Beetle. So this is from the late 70s, reprinting the earlier 70s stories. So I don't know. I thought that was interesting. Okay, so American Flag #1 by Howard Chaykin. This comic book was published by First Comics, was really influential as far as not just with it, the context as far as sex and violence, a lot of political satire, a lot of social satire. It was really a little bit smarter than a lot of comics try to be or think that they are when it comes to those sort of things. Also broke a lot of ground as far as the use of graphics and lettering and things like that. So let me get a better shot at there. Here we go. All right. Destroyer Duck #7. This cover was drawn by Frank Miller, and if you look at it really closely, it's basically a parody of the cover for the 4th issue to the first Wolverine miniseries, the one that was written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Frank Miller. And what's interesting about it is you look really closely, you see that Destroyer Duck is holding a match. And basically what happened is Frank Miller originally drew the cover with Destroyer Duck smoking a cigar, but the editor at Eclipse Comics was so anti-smoking that she basically went back and erased the cigar. So now he's just kind of like holding a match for no good reason. Uncanny X-Men #65, written by Chris Claremont, arts by Paul Smith. Really interesting issue. This is kind of not in the middle, quite towards the end. I think the next issue was the last issue of the whole Brood saga. But this issue is really interesting because the X-Men are basically in a spaceship, and they're basically waiting to die. The Brood have implanted eggs in them, and they just think it's a matter of time before the eggs go off. And you have some really interesting scenes. There's a really good, interesting scene with Nightcrawler and Wolverine discussing theology. There's a pretty touching scene between Colossus and Kitty Pryde that I thought was done really tastefully, and really interesting here. Oh, well. Oh. This is Defenders #35, written by Steve Gerber with art by Sal Buscema. Interesting comic. It's right in the middle of what was called the Headman Saga. It's just really weird and strange and offbeat, where the defenders have to fight on one hand these kind of pseudo monster type guys who are trying to take over the world. At the same time, those guys are in competition with another guy from outer space who's trying to take over the world through his self-help group of all things. And it's just kind of just strange and offbeat, but at the same time, it's fun and exciting. And it's the type of kind of writing you don't get a lot of in superhero comics these days. So, Avengers 148. This is towards the end of what became the Serpent Crown affair or the Serpent Crown saga. Basically, it is probably my favorite appearance of the Squadron Supreme. This story also included the um, what do I want to say? The chapter where Patsy Walker became Hellcat. But this issue is really interesting because a couple things. It's just a flat out parody of the Justice League of America, even down to the splash page, which is something you see a lot when the JLA would do certain stories. You get this sort of roll call either on the cover or the or splash page, and then even in the title it says 20,000 Leagues Under Justice. And this dude here is supposed to be Nelson Rockefeller. I think that's pretty funny. But the story beyond that also has a certain amount of, again, subtly played social satire. They don't really beat you over the head with it, but it's there, you know. And this is from 1976, so America had just gotten over Vietnam, just gotten over Watergate. So there's a certain sort of cynicism there towards, political figures and whatnot. But like I said, I think it was handled very well, and I think for the most part the story still holds up. Uh, Wildcats #1, written by Grant Morrison and art by Jim Lee. This was the only issue of this run that came out. I think it was just a case of people scheduling, getting conflicting and getting behind, and they just never got it together. Other people moving on to other projects and whatnot. This would have been a really interesting series because it looks like they were going for the sort of pulling together some of the ideas that was in Joe Casey's run, as well as going back to the older, more superheroic stuff. And I don't know how to describe it, but like I said, you got the science fiction element. Again, certain amount of kind of intrigue and corporate espionage, and again, social political ideas kind of drifting in there. So yeah, I thought there was an opportunity to do something really, really interesting as far as superhero comics are concerned, and it's just too bad that it fell apart. Swamp Thing #34. This was called the infamous Swamp Sex issue. Basically, what happens is Swamp Thing's in love with Abigail, and because he's a swamp monster and she's a woman, they can't actually have real sex. So the way they kind of have sex, in a way, a manner of speaking, is she eats a fruit that grows off his body, and it allows her to see the world through his eyes. The interesting thing is, not only is it a metaphor for sex, it's also pretty much a metaphor for hallucinogenics and psychedelia and those type of things. But it's still well done. It's not like you actually have to be a really crazy, tripped out hippie like Alan Moore obviously was. And Steve Bissett's from that generation as well. The guy used to do underground comics before he went to DC to do horror stuff. But it actually works as a decent bit of poetic type writing. So. Coyote #5 by Steve Englehart from the mid 80s. I just thought this was a pretty funny issue. Basically, here's the hero Coyote. He's kind of this Native American who has these kind of I don't even know how to describe his kind of powers and abilities. He's kind of the reincarnation of the coyote god, and he's fighting these this conspiracy group, while at the same time there are people from Venus who want to come to Earth and take over. But this is a very funny issue. I mean, the gag is pretty obvious. You see, he's wearing a jetpack that says Acme, and he's chasing this spirit in the desert. And I'm going to give away the ending. There's kind of a hint here when you see East Eden. So throughout the thing, like you said, there's a weird supernatural spirit running back and forth through the desert. And it turns out the spirit is actually the ghost of James Dean. That's probably not the best picture of James Dean ever, but I thought that was funny when I read it. Okay. Nope, where's the other one? I must have dropped the other one. I've got them all, three of them here, but Longbow Hunters by Mike Grell, done in the Prestige format that they originally did for Dark Knight Returns. But this is just a really, I thought it was a really great comic. It kind of got me interested in the Green Arrow where I really hadn't been previously. And just interesting things going on as far as using the format to do really more complicated bits of art and just updating the character for modern times. You know, he throws out the trick arrows. He's more of a street type hero, and just dealing with darker, I don't want to say darker, but maybe grittier stories. You know, there's stuff in here about Vietnam, drug dealing, the mob, all of these sort of things. So the CIA. So just really interesting things. I think it pretty much holds up as maybe one of the high points in the Green Arrow's history. Icon number 13. This is basically a pretty interesting satire on Luke Cage, Power Man. The hero here is called Buck Wild Mercenary Man, and the story is called It's Always Christmas. So if you're really familiar with Luke Cage, Power Man from the 70s and 80s, you know his catchphrase was always Sweet Christmas. It's kind of a loving tribute, but at the same time kind of a satire, pointing out that this story was written in the mid-90s, that just that kind of sort of jive-talking black exploitation version of a black hero might be a little bit dated, but at the same time, you know, it's done with love and affection here. She-Hulk number 1. I just think it's neato keen. Well, actually, I'll say a little bit more about that. It's obviously I think it's very important in the fact that it kind of brought that kind of zany sort of parody aspect to the character even more. And I think it was exactly sort of thing that you just wouldn't have expected Marvel to put out in the late 80s, early 90s. You know, deliberate gags, silly jokes, a lot of fourth wall breaking, a lot of characters talking directly to the reader and things like that. So it brought a different type of humor than I think a lot of people really expected out of a serious superhero comic. So okay, so, excuse me. So JLA, Rock of Ages. This is probably my favorite Justice League story, or modern Justice League story. This is Cerberus Weekly, and this is issue 26. What this was during the early 80s, Dave Sims reprinted his he basically was reprinting all the issues of Cerberus and with some extra content in it. And this was notable because this is issue 26, which is kind of where Cerberus took a turn from just being a parody comic to having more broader social satire and so on and so forth. Plus, it's also interesting because there's some sketches here from the late 70s, 79, 80 or so, where I guess he was offered a chance to do Howard the Duck for Marvel Comics, and I guess this was him trying his hand at it. Okay, let's see here. Let's save that. Doom Patrol, Crawling Through the Wreckage. Grant Morrison. Batwoman Elegy, Greg Rucker and J.H. Williams. It's a really great story here. Look at this. This is Low Life. I've got another one laying around here somewhere, but I couldn't find it. It was more of a collection. Basically, this is an alternative indie comic that Ed Brubaker, yes, that Ed Brubaker did before he started working for DC and Marvel. Kind of more or less slice of life, not quite autobiographical, maybe semi-autobiographical type stories. It's pretty interesting because he's willing to let the character actually look like a bad person, as far as the characters like drug use and stealing things from work and bad relationships and stuff like that. Pirate Corps, this was the precursor to Hectic Planet, and I was just thinking about this because Running with Comics had shown it on his station, his channel recently. Doctor Marvel Preview number 10. This has the Death of the Ancient One. This was one of the first comic books I ever had when I was really, really young. And of course, I didn't have this actual physical copy. And I can't even remember how I got it. I want to say, I think my biological dad gave it to me. And I couldn't even really read very well when I had it. And I kept it around for a couple years, and I could read it, and I was able to understand all the words, but still the story was still way over my head at that time. Okay, the first 4 issues of the Ed Brubaker, Darwin Cook, yeah, Catwoman. Just a really great story. I was going to do a video of this at one time, but I don't know. I think I just forgot about doing it. But maybe I'll do it. Maybe I will do it because it's a really, really great story. This I almost did a video about. This is Untamed Love by Fantagraphic Books, and basically what it is a reprint of old Frank Frazetta love stories that fell into the public domain. So it's really pretty interesting for kind of his pseudo-historical type reasons. Robin number 40. This is pretty interesting. This is the issue where where Tim Drake's girlfriend actually attempts to come on to him sexually, and he basically kind of takes a step back and says that they're really teenagers and they're too young and they should try to wait. And I think for the most part, the story was handled pretty tastefully. I actually like the way it worked out. I think a little bit later in this series, there's also the whole thing with Spoiler becoming pregnant and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think it was an interesting take on young love and stuff that you don't always see in modern day superhero comics, with everybody trying harder and harder to be so adult and whatnot. But okay. Similarly, New Teen Titans 38 by Marv Wolfman and George Perez. This is the issue where Dick Grayson gives up the Robin identity, and Wally West leaves the team just to go back to college. We also get to see Tara, who is joined the Titans to spy on her for Deathstroke, and it's never stated outright, but it's kind of implied that they're having like a sexual relationship as well. Wildcats X-Men #1 crossover, story by Scott Lobdell and art by Travis Charest. Just some really great, amazing art in this particular comic. It seemed like for a moment that Travis Charest was kind of the next big thing as far as like comic book artists are concerned, and I think he was just he just kept having problems with like deadlines and scheduling and other work he was doing, and I'm not too sure what he's up to now, but you don't see him do too much comics work. But yeah, really great artwork in here. Here's my copy of Ms. Marvel #1. The story, I did do a video on this one. The story's pretty interesting. in a weird, wonky sort of way because it seemed like Gary Conway was trying to make this actually a Spider-Man satellite comic. So you've got Spider-Man supporting characters here. She's fighting an old Spider-Man villain here, the Scorpion. So yeah. Uh, New Mutants 19. I just remember reading this back in the days when it first came out, and I just thought it the most confusing thing ever. The whole thing with demon bears and changing people into Native Americans and just craziness. Reed Fleming, number one. Just a crazy, just a crazy comic book about the world's toughest milkman. I know Captain Strangelove has talked about this comic before. Gates of Eden. This was a comic book that came out in the early 80s, early mid 80s, and there are a lot of former and former underground comic book artists working on this. And basically, it's all stories set in the 60s or having something to do with the 60s or whatever. Pretty interesting stuff here. And here's a back cover by Rick Griffin, I guess. I don't know if you can see that, if you can make it out or not. But yeah, uh, Dreadstar number 3. I used to have number 1. I don't know where it's at anymore. But this is Jim Starlin's series that he did for Marvel's creator-owned imprint Epic, and basically he's just picking up where he left off with a couple of graphic novels, just big, dark, cosmic space opera type stuff. Zenoa Tales, this is number 11. They actually turned this into a Saturday morning cartoon called Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. And the art is just really nice. I need to get some more of these. Just very heavily influenced by like old school comic strip artists. There's some Frank Frazetta in there. There's Milton Caniff, Alex Raymond, Wally Wood. You can see all those type of guys in Mark Schultz's art. So okay, and that's it. I gotta thank everybody for listening. It was kind of not exactly 50, kind of 50-ish or so. I hope everybody enjoyed watching. I'll tag a couple people. I'll tag Carnage Man 99 if he hasn't been tagged. Tom Ray if he hasn't been tagged, and Comic Book Thug if he hasn't been tagged. Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot, and you have a good day.